Welcome to the Remembrance podcast, brought to you by the History Club. World War I is one of the most famous historic events of all time, but how much do you really know about it? Today, we will be telling you about life in the trenches, what life was like for women, how we remember, and much more. First, over to Miyawe for PAL's Battalions.
Good morning, and if it's not morning for you, then you came late. I'm Miyawe, and today I'm going to be telling you about PAL's Battalions. Now, there is something you should know about how this idea came about. So here's a summary. At the start of World War I, Britain had the smallest army. It was the best trained army, but let's be honest, this war needed bodies rather than amazing well-trained soldiers. The reason for this is that there was no conscription in Britain before the war. In most of the other countries, they had millions of soldiers who had received basic training and were ready to be called upon in case of war. This was not the case for Britain, and it was a problem. In World War I, the more people you could bear to lose, the more likely you were to win, and this was a war of attrition.
How did Britain solve this problem? Well, the government was still reluctant to force people to join, so instead they tried to convince people to volunteer. They launched a massive campaign of recruitment. You've probably seen all those war recruiting posters with Lord Kitchener and his big moustache pointing at you, and the words, "Your country needs you." In order to make the most of this initiative, they allowed friends, colleagues, or even football teams to join together and be in the same battalions. These were called, of course, PAL's Battalions.
If you were told someone you knew died, the chances were their entire battalion died. You would be losing all your loved ones in one fell swoop over there. Now, this became such a devastation that the army stopped the program before the end of the war. One such battalion in Edinburgh was the Mccrae's Battalion.
Sir George Mcrae was a councillor, city treasurer, member of Parliament for East Edinburgh, and senior civil servant. Mcrae was also involved in the volunteer movement and eventually was in command of the 6th Territorial Battalion of the Royal Scots. With a lifelong commitment to improving the welfare of ordinary citizens, he had been knighted in 1908. Sir George was well known and respected as a man of integrity.
Of the growing pressure on sportsmen to sign up to become a soldier, Sir George set up a meeting at Tynecastle Park to talk to the players of the Hearts team about his plan to have a company composed entirely of sportsmen within his battalion. Hearts directors released the players from their contracts, and 11 signed up for the new battalion. 2 others quickly followed, and with 3 already serving, 16 Heartsmen were in service.
In a grand meeting at Joshua Hall on Friday 27th November 1914, the Recruitment Drive was launched, a call to arms, in the bid to recruit 1,000 men to Mccrae's newly formed battalion. Sir George made a rousing speech that would long be remembered by everyone present. "I would not, could not," he simply stated, "ask you to serve unless I share the danger at your side." 13 Hearts players took the podium that night, and supported by neighbouring football clubs, Hibernia, Raith Rovers, Falkirk, Dunfermline, St Bernards, and East Fife, the good name of football was restored. These players were joined by other full-time sportsmen, rugby players, boxers, athletes, and in a record of 6 days, some 600 supporters also helped to form Mccrae's battalion of 1,350 officers and men. The battalion soon became known as the Sporting Battalion. A Hearts minute book from the club recorded that the lead established by these gallant youths reverberated through the length of the land.
The 16th Service Battalion Royal Scots, known as Mccrae's Battalion, was mobilised in December 1914. Billeted in George Heriot's School and the nearby Castle Brewery, they undertook basic training around the city and the Lothians. In June 1915, Mccrae's battalion left Edinburgh to complete its training at Ripon in Yorkshire and then on to Salisbury Plain. They were ready for deployment by the end of 1915. Home support for those servicemen and women was significant. The grounds at Tynecastle were available for recruitment drives. War fundraising matches were played and collections were taken at matches for military comforts. Over 100 footballs and other home comforts were sent to the battlefields. Many women were recruited into important jobs vacated by men, and indeed many cities saw the growth of women's football as a popular pastime. Hearts Football Club continued to play, although much depleted, to provide comfort for home workers.
The 16th Royal Scots sailed over to France in January 1916 and quickly saw action at armouries before heading to the area of River Somme, where the Battalion took part in the major British offensive that started at 1st July 1916. This was the blackest single day in the history of the British Army, and the staggering losses were suffered with over 19,000 killed and almost 40,000 wounded.
Mccrae's battalion lost nearly 3/4 of its attacking strength as it was deployed and fought in the vicinity of Contal-Mason, where Free Hearts players were amongst those who were killed. The Battle of Somme raged for another 5 months, and in August 1916, another Heartsman was killed. Mccrae's battalion was subsequently on the front line until the spring of 1918, and were in action in several battles around Arras and the River Lice.
Since 1919, at 11 a.m. on the second Sunday of November, otherwise known as Remembrance Sunday, a 2-minute silence has been observed at war memorials, cenotaphs, religious services, and other public spaces all across the world. The silence is a tribute to those who lost their lives fighting for their country.
At the end of the conflict, monuments were erected across the world in remembrance of the fallen. The Heart of Midlothian War Memorial is one such commemoration.
Some amazing information about the battalions from Miyawe. Now over to Eilidh and Molly for the soldiers' lives in the trenches.
Hello, we're here to talk about life in the trenches during the war. We will cover 5 topics. The first topic is hygiene.
Hygiene in the trenches was not good. A very common diagnosis to have was trench foot. This was caused by the cold, wet and muddy conditions that the soldiers would have to endure daily throughout the years of the war. Trench foot would cause swelling of the foot and ankle, numbness, severe pain and discoloration. Many men had to get their leg and foot amputated. A quote from Robert Sherriff's book, No Leading Lady from 1968 states that some of their feet were horrible to look at, raw skin and bleeding blisters and big angry sores. Their army boots rarely fitted comfortably. They were made in a few standard sizes. A man was lucky if he got a pair that was neither too big nor too small. To march all day in them with blisters feet must have been a torment. Body lice was another big problem during the war. The little bugs would be everywhere on a soldier's body. There was no escape. They would leave a poor soldier with itchy red spots covering the whole body. They created a horrible stale smell too. There were many ways that the soldiers invented to try and get rid of the irritating bugs. There was a method of burning the lice with candles. This job was very dangerous and could end up with a soldier's clothes on fire. From a useful website, we find that where possible, the army arranged for men to have baths in huge vats of hot water while their clothes were being put through delousing machines. Unfortunately, this rarely worked. A fair proportion of the eggs remained in the clothes, and within 2 or 3 hours of the clothes being put on again, a man's body heat had hatched them out. Trench food. Our second subject is trench food. A total of 3,240,948 tons of food was sent from Britain to the soldiers fighting in France and Belgium during World War I. At first, the soldiers were restricted to 10 ounces of meat and 8 ounces of vegetables a day. But as the German blockade became more effective and the British Army grew, in 1916 the rations had to be reduced to 6 ounces of meat a day so that every member of the army could be fed. Later after that, troops who were not fighting on the front line only got meat 9 days every 30. The daily rotation for bread was also reduced in 1917, and the British Army attempted to give soldiers 3,574 calories a day that dietitians said they needed, but many people argued this was not enough for the soldiers.
Our third section covers the dangers that threatened a soldier's life when in the trenches. It was estimated that around 75,000 British soldiers in the war had been killed by British shells which were intended for the Germans. It was also estimated that 1/3 of all casualties on the Western Front were killed or wounded while in the trenches. During the first 2 weeks of the Battle of Passchendaele, the British, Australian and Canadian guns fired 4,283,550 shells at the German defences. It is estimated that throughout the First World War, the Allies used 5 million tons of artillery shells against enemy positions. When a large amount of shells fired at once was called shell fire. If soldiers were exposed to a lot of shell fire, then they became in danger of developing shell shock. The early symptoms of shell shock included tiredness, irritability, giddiness, lack of concentration, and headaches. Eventually, the men suffered mental breakdowns, making it impossible for them to remain on the front line. Our second last topic is boredom, and how the soldiers tried to keep themselves entertained. When the soldiers became bored, they became very inventive. They started from simply having pillow fights when they raced in wheelbarrows, and even did some wrestling in the mules. Majority of these activities were set up by World War I officers because they wanted to keep the soldiers fighting and don't become too sad, scared or lonely. At one point they made a Christmas truce. This meant that there were unofficial ceasefires along the Western Front around Christmas 1914. Men played football games with one another and shared photos of their families and shared their lives with other soldiers, both Allies and Central Powers.
Our final topic is about gas attacks. People knew about poison gases a long time before the war, but this doesn't make it any less scary or deadly. The French army was first to introduce the deadly substance into the First World War. They fired tear gas at the Germans. The most common gas used in World War I was mustard gas. It is estimated that around 85% of the 91,000 gas deaths were caused by this. Mustard gas caused irritated eyes, temporary blindness, runny nose, coughing, shortness of breath, and sinus pain. This was what Hitler experienced temporary blindness from on the armistice.
Thank you, girls. Now we know about what life was like in the front line, but how was it back home? Let's hear about the women.
We are going to talk about the women involved in World War I. One of the most famous things women did in World War I was nursing. Let us tell you about the story of a former pupil from George Watson's college who was involved in nursing. Her name was Daisy Cole. Daisy Kathleen Mary Coles was born in Wandsworth, London on the 27th of May 1893. Daisy's parents, Walter and Edith, came from the south of England. Walter was born in Hampshire and Edith was a clergyman's daughter from London. With her parents, Daisy moved to Scotland because Walter was a civil servant with the Scottish Office. By 1903, the family were living at 204 Bransfield Place when Daisy was enrolled at George Watson's Ladies' College just before her 10th birthday.
In 1914, at the outbreak of war, 21-year-old Daisy joined the local voluntary aid detachment, becoming a VAD nurse. Daisy would have been trained in basic first aid and simple nursing. VAD nurses were there to support the professional nurses. She would have helped to dress, undress and wash the men. This would have been a big step for middle-class young women like Daisy, who would never have been alone and unchaperoned with a member of the opposite sex before.
On the night of the 30th of September 1917, during a hostile air raid, 3 bombs were dropped on the hostel at 10:40 p.m. One struck a marquee occupied by patients and 2 nurses who were on duty. In all, 4 nurses, including Daisy, died with 16 patients. There were 67 wounded. Her name has recently been added to our war memorial in a bid to celebrate all the pupils who gave up their lives in World War I.
Women also worked elsewhere on the home front. The nations at war mobilized their entire populations. The side that could produce more weapons and supply more troops would prevail in the end. War attrition is the military strategy consisting of attempts to win a war by wearing down the enemy to the point of collapse. Women took on new roles in the workforce, notably in war production and agriculture. Many women took paid jobs outside the home for the first time. By 1918, there were 5 million women working in Britain. The money they earned helped the family's budgets, and they made new friends in the factory, office, or shop. One of the areas of employment where new opportunities opened up for women was in transport. Women began working as bus conductresses, ticket collectors, porters, carriage cleaners, and bus drivers. During the war, the number of women working on the railways rose from 9,000 to 50,000. Another way women helped during the war was through factories and munitions. During World War I, large numbers of women were recruited into jobs vacated by men who had gone to fight in the war. The high demand for weapons resulted in the munition factories becoming the largest single employer of women during 1918. This was a very dangerous job due to the large amount of explosives in the factory. Also, girls who worked in munition factories tended to get yellow skin because of the toxic chemical. They were nicknamed canaries or munitionettes.
The war had a big impact on women's role in society. One of the biggest ones was the fact that in 1918, many women over the age of 30 were given the right to vote. In 1928, this was extended to all women over the age of 21. Life on the home front during the war let women prove they could work as hard as men in a wide range of jobs. They deserved the same rights as they had also contributed hugely to the war effort.
And of course, animals also played a big role in World War I, so let's hear what it was like for them, from horses to seagulls.
Although humans played the main role in World War I, animal parts were often overlooked. So here are the amazing and gross animals of World War I. One of the main and more known animals was the carrier pigeon. They served to transport messages to and from the front. However, the Germans soon trained hawks especially to target and bring down these pigeons. Another common bird involved with Britain in World War I was the seagull. Yes, the seagull. Did you know that Britain tried and failed to train seagulls to spot German submarines? Horses are well known for their services in World War I, which included transporting food and water, travelling long distances with wounded soldiers on their back, and galloping into battle with no fear. Some dogs were specially trained to bring medicine to wounded soldiers on the battlefield so they could live until help came.
An unwanted pest was rats. In the trenches, they lived in their thousands, eating, breeding, and feeding. The trenches were so rat-infested that multiple would be spotted by one person in the space of a few hours. Along with rats, lice were a huge part of life in the trenches. Everyone was so infested with lice that it was said that if someone threw their shirt onto the floor, it would keep moving from the sheer amount of lice on it. Although cats are often said to have 9 lives, Faith didn't take any chances with her kitten Panda in World War I. And on September 6, 1940, the mother of one apparently had a funny feeling and moved her recently born kitten from the warm upper floors to the basement of the church she lives in, just a day before London was hit by German air bombs. She and her kitten, Panda, were rescued from beneath the rubble by Father Henry Ross, and she was later awarded a special medal for bravery for steadfast courage in the Battle of London.
Next up, let's hear about the technology and tanks that were used in World War I.
And I'm going to talk to you about tanks and this brand new weapon changed the face of the war. Due to the nature of war, lots of technologies had to be improved and even some created from scratch. One of these new technologies was tanks. Tanks were the only way to effectively cross trenches and wire entanglements. Before tanks were created, one of the biggest dangers facing soldiers who were crossing no man's land, the stretch of land between the two opposing sides. If they did manage to get across without being shot by machine guns, soldiers had to cross barbed wire and defences. This may not seem like such a technology advanced system, but it was deadly and cost thousands of lives. Soldiers got entangled, slowed down, and hard to try and dismantle this from barbed wire. The more you get stuck. This changed the war because it meant that not only could they mount heavy weapons, but they could also help get rid of the threat of barbed wire that was causing a lot of trouble to get through. Tanks were not perfect though. They often got stuck in muddy terrain. After the introduction by the British, many countries made their own tanks, including the French with their FT-17 light tank, the first tank with a turret, and much later the Germans when they realised the benefit of tanks outweighed the flaws. They were armed with heavy weapons and machine guns, and could also go through anything. As the war progressed, tanks progressed too, and this is one of the most rapid developments in the war. A decisive weapon that really made a difference.
A famous part of World War One was Gallipoli, but what was it?
Hello, I'm Kyle, and now I'm going to tell you about the Battle of Gallipoli, which took place in the Turkish peninsula between the Aegean and Dardanelles. On the 25th of April 1915, a campaign was launched that would ultimately cause 250,000 casualties. It was deemed one of the most infamous campaigns of World War I. The Entente powers, Britain, France and Russia, sought to weaken the empire, the Ottoman Empire of course, the name of Turkey at the time, thereby helping the Russian war effort. The campaign is categorised by a failed naval attack followed up by a failed land invasion. This failure of a campaign can be put into ignorance. It wasn't the first time the British lost manpower and battles due to ignorance, such as in the Mesopotamian campaign, in which the British won a tough victory by a great cost of around 200,000 British lives. The commanders of the British forces displayed complacency and believed that it would be an easy victory. They had underestimated the strength of the Ottoman Empire. Some would argue that the whole campaign was poorly conceived from the beginning. Because of the ignorance of the Gallipoli campaign, it nearly saw Winston Churchill's career put to an end or derailed. But there's a link between Gallipoli and George Watson's. Douglas Marshall Stuart, the son of Mr. J. Stuart. He was born in 1894 and went through GWC 1902 to 1912. He began to study agriculture at university, and previous to war he was gazetted to the 4th RS. He went through with his unit through Gallipoli, Egypt and Palestine campaigns, 1915 to 1917, and rose to the rank of captain. He was wounded in the head at the Third Battle of Gaza on November 2nd, 1917, and unfortunately died in Edinburgh on January 1919.
I'm sure you have learned a lot about World War I and what it was like. Now over to Amelia to talk about remembrance and all the different ways we remember the event.
Hi, I'm Amelia, and I'm here to tell you about remembrance and the various ways that it takes. Poppies. They're the most well-known symbol of remembrance. Everyone knows they're red, right? But what some people don't know is there are actually other colours of poppies, and they all represent different things. I've done a bit of research into this amazing topic. The red poppy is the most famous. It represents all the people who sacrificed their lives in World War I and all of the conflicts that followed that. It's said to represent remembrance and hope. However, there are some people who think the red poppy glorifies war and fighting, so they can choose to wear a white poppy instead. The white poppy is there to promote peace. The white poppy also remembers the people who died in conflict, but it focuses on achieving peace. Then there are the purple and black poppies. The black poppy remembers the African and Caribbean community's contribution to the war, and the purple poppy represents the animal victims of the war. A lot of animals were killed during the war, particularly horses. The purple poppy is to remember them, and donations go to animal charities. Personally, I think that the white poppy is quite significant because it's trying to signify the fact that World War I was actually kind of pointless. Basically, the Archduke of Austria and his wife were assassinated in Serbia, and as a result, due to all the alliances formed by all the countries, most of the world got involved. So because of that one assassination, the world was at war for 4 years. And as a result of World War I, millions of people died and were injured. The number of deaths and casualties is really almost impossible to count. Families who lost sons and fathers began remembering them through family memorials. The first memorial to be announced was a trophy in April 1916. A man called Mr. Ford wrote it in memory of his 2 sons who were killed in World War I on the 28th of June 1915 in the same place within yards of each other. After that, more and more memorials were made, but even then, not every person who died had a memorial specific to them. That's one of the reasons we have the cenotaph in London. The cenotaph remembers everyone who died during the war because there were too many unknown deaths. The Queen and lots of other important figures lay wreaths there on the 11th of November, so you've probably seen it on TV. Watson's gets to lay a wreath there too, which is a huge honour that not many people have. In Scotland, the names of all Scottish soldiers who died in the wars are recorded in the War Memorial at the castle, but there are also lots and lots of private war memorials scattered all over Europe. For example, at Watson's we have our War Memorial. It has the names of lots of the Watsonians who died in war. It was originally built where the old school was, but when the school moved here, it was decided it was part of the school and that it couldn't be left behind. The War Memorial is very important to the way that we do remembrance at Watson's. Now, the school actually goes into very personal stories of people from the war. I think this is a really nice thing to do. It just makes it feel a bit more real and we can connect to the people. The first remembrance ceremony ever took place in 1919, so that's 1 year exactly after the end of the war. A former pupil said, "On the 11th of November, we joined in the National Act of Remembrance by observing the 2-minute silence in our classrooms. The drums of the corps sounded in the corridors, and the classes, suspending their work, stood to attention for the prescribed time with a very full understanding of and sympathy with the meaning and significance of the act." The way we remember is constantly changing. As times change, so does remembrance. The first woman, Daisy Coles, was added to the Watson's War Memorial just 1 year ago.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast and that you've learnt much more about World War I and remembrance. To end this podcast, Eilidh will play Last Post. Thank you for listening, everyone.